This is a revision presentation on the concept of spare capacity. We're talking about this concept in the macroeconomic sense, so when the whole economy has spare capacity, rather than in the micro sense where we might be talking about an individual firm. The simplest way to illustrate the concept of spare capacity is with a PPF diagram, production possibility frontier. And if we're producing at this star, then we're producing within our PPF. We're producing within our PPF, that means we're not using all of our available factors of production. So we have within our economy spare capacity. We have some factors that are being unused. But a slightly more useful way to think about spare capacity is in the context of the economic cycle. We have our trend rate of growth, which for the UK is around 2.5% a year. Then on top of that we can add on our actual rate of growth. Now the trend rate of growth reflects the fact that we have improving factors of production. The trend rate of growth actually shows us our normal productive potential. So it's at the points where we're producing below that normal productive potential, for example that gap there, that shows us spare capacity. We're not using all of our factors of production. And that also gives us a clue as to what it is that actually causes this spare capacity. What causes us not to use all of our normal productive potential? Well, we need to understand that this blue actual GDP line comes from aggregate demand. It's aggregate demand that causes fluctuations in GDP around the trend rate of growth. The trend rate itself comes from long run aggregate supply because it comes from the long run factors of production, land, labour, capital and enterprise. So this gap here, and those of you that think, isn't this just a negative output gap? You're right, negative output gap and spare capacity in macro are essentially synonymous. That gap there between actual GDP and our productive potential is caused by a lack of aggregate demand. So it's lack of aggregate demand that causes spare capacity in an economy. So if we think of this in the sense of the PPF, say we started producing at full potential within our economies, this would be without any output gap at all, and then we had some fall in aggregate demand that brought us to a point inside our PPF. It is again the lack of aggregate demand that causes the spare capacity. It causes us not to use all of our supply potential. The consequences for an economy would be typically cyclical unemployment. Cyclical unemployment, of course, by definition is caused by a lack of aggregate demand. We've got workers that aren't being used because there isn't enough demand. It always goes along with spare capacity. We'd also expect to see low confidence, partly due to that high unemployment and partly just due to the fact that people can see that there isn't enough demand in the economy to use up the supply. We're going to see relatively slow rates of growth. And also significantly we expect to see lower inflation. It's because firms with unused factors of production aren't going to find big increases in costs. They're not going to need to increase their prices at any point. It's going to keep inflation low. And in severe cases, spare capacity and negative output gaps could even lead to deflationary situations. So what do you do about this? Well, it's all about demand-side policies, because it's demand-side policies that will create the extra aggregate demand that you need in order to use up the spare capacity that's present in the economy. So for example, you could reduce interest rates to stimulate borrowing and create extra aggregate demand. You could increase government spending, with the G component of aggregate demand being directly affected there. That will create more aggregate demand and again use up the spare capacity. Or reducing some kind of tax. I mean, for example, reducing income tax would mean that consumers have higher incomes, they'd be able to spend some of that extra income, creating more consumer spending, again increasing aggregate demand, getting rid of the lack of aggregate demand that is the cause of spare capacity.